Welcome to the TokenMarket.net podcast. I am your host, Gavin Knight. Thank you for tuning in. Check out our site for digital asset research, a calendar of upcoming events, and many future upcoming releases. Our podcast features team members of projects in the cryptocurrency space to help shed light on their developments. Just because a project is on our podcast doesn't mean we recommend investment, so always research and engage wisely. I'm here with Arthur Brightman, CTO of Tezos. You can find them at tezos.com. They're going to be doing an ICO soon, and we wanted to talk about their project. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how you and your team got into the space and how Tezos started?
Thank you. I think personally, I heard about Bitcoin really early on. I think before the network was actually launched. And I wrote a draft in my Gmail folder to look into it, and I didn't until 2012. And I don't think I bought a Bitcoin until like 2013. So I was comparatively late in the game for someone who heard about it early on. But I was super interested in Bitcoin. I tried to build a couple applications around it. And one thing that had an influence on me was I had some conversations with Bitcoin people at the time, and I was wondering about the sustainability of the proof of work system. There's issues with proof of work once you run out of block reward, and there was issues of miner concentration. And at the time, one thing I was told was like, it doesn't really matter. What really matters in Bitcoin is the set of unspent outputs. And as long as you have that, you could always switch to consensus algorithm. You can switch a lot of things. Bitcoin isn't so much an algorithm. Bitcoin is a ledger. And you can have different algorithms operate that ledger. And that resonated with me, and it gave me a lot of confidence in the future. But over time, it didn't seem like it was really possible to actually easily upgrade that algorithm. And it didn't seem that it seemed that it was a governance issue in some sense. The miners supposedly had some powers, but their interests were not necessarily aligned with the interests of the stakeholders. And so the idea of Tezos is to try to have this governance so that you can actually evolve the ledger, so that you can say, okay, we're going to keep the state of the ledger, but we might change the way we do consensus, we might change different things, and not have to have a crisis. And at the time, it was super theoretical. The paper came out in 2014, and one of the first lines of the paper is say, hey, we're worried about the difficulty of upgrading the Bitcoin protocol and how that relates to miners' interest, and how's that going to play out. And we've experienced certainly tensions along those lines recently. So I started working on Tezos, and at first it was just a hobby, a small project, but it started gathering more attention, and most of the attention actually came only last summer when Ethereum broke. And I think it's because for the longest time, people had this idea that blockchains were completely mathematical, they were pure algorithms. So talking about governance didn't make any sense. The whole point is that there's no governance. The whole point is that its code is low. And all of a sudden, people saw, hey, the Ethereum Foundation actually has a lot of power. They have the power to suggest a fork and to create consensus around that fork and to edit the ledger. And a lot of people say that it was the wrong decision, or it was bad. I'm not I don't want to take a position here, but it struck me that a lot of people were very surprised that this was possible because they hadn't really thought through the dynamics of hard forks. And at the same time, there were issues with smart contracts, smart contract verification. And so since our paper was primarily about the dynamic and economics of hard forks and how to design, say, smart contracts, we started getting a lot of attention. And that's where we decided to try and go to a release.
So yeah, it says you have a consensus mechanism so that Tezos can evolve and incorporate new innovations. But what happens if somebody, submits code or a proposal that's damaging to the network? Is it possible that someone with enough stake could forward a damaging proposal?
Yeah, that's quite possible. So, you still need to have more than a majority of the network in order to pass a proposal. But theoretically, if someone had, maybe own half of the stake in the network and they could pass a proposal that hurts the network, it's true that's possible. But if they did this, it would really severely damage the value of their holdings. So, it would be cutting your nose to spite your face. It wouldn't be a very rational way to act. And even if it did this, so we're designed to avoid hard forks as much as possible. We don't want to upgrade through hard forks, but it's still a tool in a toolbox. And if someone does that, the worst case scenario is that you'll hard fork the network without this guy and his stake, and you'll just keep going on. So in practice, you wouldn't even harm the network that much. You would just really decrease the value of your holdings. So it's not a very pragmatic attack.
So are you using proof of stake, or how are you doing consensus on the base level, and what's the scalability like for Tezos?
Right. So the proof of stake algorithm. So we went to proof of stake early on because part of the idea is we didn't want to have an interest group for mining, which would be detached from the interest group for stakeholders. So the proof of stake we have, it's based on a paper at the time called Chain of Activity with some modifications. If you look at the description, it's fairly similar to what other projects in the space have been suggesting. It's it's not that different from Casper. Essentially, you proceed in epochs, and so unlike Casper, we don't have a fixed set of validators. We proceed in epochs. At the beginning of an epoch, you elect leaders for every block, and you have these leaders sign the chain.
And it says future proof. Are you talking about
also,
quantum resistance, or like what does future proof mean to you?
Future proof means that as innovation happened in the States, we're not going to stagnate. One of the best innovation in the ledger space at this time, I think, is Zcash. The technology behind Zcash is incredible, and what they're doing is extremely valuable. When the Zcash paper came out, we're talking before Zcash, the cryptocurrency, the paper came out. They wanted to put it into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin said no. They didn't want it. They're like, well, we're not comfortable with this. We don't want to. They didn't want to experiment. And then Zcash said, well, okay, maybe we can be a sidechain. Oh, well, no, we need to have another opcode for sidechains, and also there's some consensus problem with sidechains. And so in the end, Zcash became just his own independent cryptocurrency. And then Bitcoin was like, well, why do you create an altcoin instead of contributing to Bitcoin? So it's kind of this weird situation where a lot of cryptocurrency starts, and when they start, they take in all the innovations they can at the time, but then they fail to innovate. So Ethereum seems to be willing to innovate and seems to be willing to change its ledger, but they're doing it with hard forks, which I think is fairly disruptive to the ecosystem.
So I see Zuko is one of your advisors on the Zcash front. So
yes,
are you guys interested in fungibility and sort of the ways to protect the privacy of users, or what kind of insights has he helped provide?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think fungibility is critical. We didn't want to start with it because we have an upgradable ledger, so we might as well use it to upgrade progressively. But that's one of the first things we want to roll out. And I'll point something interesting. If you look at the design of Casper for Ethereum, they're doing a tremendous amount of work to try to detect censorship from miners, censorship of transaction, and try to avoid that. And it gets kind of like a Rube Goldberg contraption. But the best way to protect censorship resistance is not to do it as a level of the consensus algorithm or of the block signers. It's to do it by just having the transactions be anonymous and private. And so if your transactions are private, then you can't be censored because all transactions look alike. And to me, that's a much more elegant way of protecting censorship resistance. We think also that the zero knowledge proofs, they can do a lot more than privacy. They can help with scalability a lot. So one thing you can do, which it's not being done yet, the technology for doing this is maybe a year or two away. But what you could do is you could aggregate a lot of transactions into a single zero knowledge proof. And so your entire block, instead of being composed of many transactions, could just be one proof. And so if you want to validate the entire blockchain, it's just, you just validate this one proof, and that the state of the ledger is correct at a given block level. It's completely solves the problem of gas, right? Instead of having people submit to a smart contract and having the miner run through the execution of the smart contracts and cut it with gas and so on and so forth. You just run the smart contract on your machine. You create a proof that you ran it correctly, and you submit your proof to the ledger. And so I think that's going to be a critical component of any modern cryptocurrency. So that's definitely going to be a big focus in our work once we release.
So what language are you using for developers, and how easy is it to learn? I know Ethereum has Solidity, which is easy for a lot of developers to get into because they're familiar. So what would I use to program on the Tezos network?
So it depends. So if you want to do smart contracts, or smart contract language is called Michelson, and it's much higher level than the EVM, but it's much lower level than Solidity. You could think it's kind of like Bitcoin script, but more powerful than Bitcoin script and with more type checking. We designed the smart contract language to make it easily amenable to formal verification, which is a technique where you can take your program and prove that it's correct, like prove that it doesn't lose money, or prove that it doesn't do something you don't want it to do. For core development, if you want to contribute to the ledger itself, then we're using OCaml, which is also a statically typed functional programming language. And the reason I mentioned core is that today in Ethereum development, if you're interested in doing a project and maybe having financial success, the way you do it in Ethereum is with an ICO, right? You create an app coin, and then you release your app coin on Ethereum, and you do your ICO, and then you keep some of the tokens, and hopefully that works out. But this is because in Ethereum, all functionalities are supposed to be at this smart contract layer. We actually have a way to incorporate functionality at the core protocol layer. So the way you would do it is actually write a change to the core protocol. Say you want to have futures prediction market. What you could do is actually write a module for the core protocol that supports natively prediction contracts, and then submit a proposal to the network by saying, hey, I want to improve our core protocol by adding this feature. And if we do that, I would like to issue tokens to myself in exchange for doing so. And so I think we'll see just as much development in smart contracts as we'll see development of the core protocol. So the smart contract language, Michelson, it's not going to be as easy to learn as Solidity. But the question I don't think is how easy to learn it is that how easy it is to write a contract that you are confident is going to do what you want it to do. And that's very hard in Solidity. It's full of gotchas, like you saw in the DAO. It's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. We designed a language that makes it very hard to shoot yourself in the foot.
So is it possible for if a large group of holders are interested in what someone's developing to help fund them, or what ways do you plan to sort of jumpstart the development community? Because obviously, one of Ethereum's biggest strengths is that so many people are excited to work on it or are working on it for various reasons. So how do you plan to get developers using this and businesses using this so that Tezos can become something more than just the blockchain?
Yeah, so I don't think that it's purely a numbers game. You could have a ton of people interested in Ethereum and happy to develop applications, but if they don't develop self applications which can actually be used in a business setting, then it's not gonna get them very far. So I think we prefer to focus on quality instead of quantity. And obviously our Michelson language is kind of the base building block. We will be releasing languages on top of it, which might be slightly easier to use. But mostly, I think a lot of people in the blockchain space have based their thesis on the internet. And based on the internet, they say, well, this is going to be the new internet. So what do we know in the internet? Well, interconnectivity matters. So, we'll build applications for talking from one blockchain to another. And I actually don't think that buys you a lot. Or they said, well, we want to have many developers write many apps And I don't think that works that well, because if you write an app, if you write a web page with JavaScript and your web page crashes, it's not a big deal, Or if you write an app on an app store and the app, the app is supposed to track your calories and it crashes, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. If you're doing applications which are smart contracts, which are meant to take custody and manage assets, then it's a lot more important to be safe in what you're doing. And so the development pattern that we've seen on the internet and on app stores is going to be quite different, I think, for smart contracts.
Yeah, it's still possible to make a mistake, right? Like I understand like the framework and the way you've built it and the language makes it more difficult. But things like the DAO, it's still possible for someone to really shoot themselves in the foot on Tezos, but you've put a lot of work into preventing that. Like, right?
So the DAO is a good example. In the DAO, what happened is in Solidity, you can call a contract in the middle of your function. You can call another contract, and then the control returns to your function, and you can continue what you're doing, and that causes a reentrancy bug. In Michelson, all the contracts are pure functions, which push any state change to the end of the function, and so you wouldn't be able to do that bug unless you really wanted to. So that's just and it's not like we saw the DAO and said like, hey, we need to have this feature. It was just based on the design that we have, this type of bug didn't exist.
Right, but I mean, giving people the ability to do smart contracts, there's still a possibility, right, that they will make a mistake. But
of course,
obviously, what you're saying is you've spent a lot of time for core, at the core level, so that there is better security. And I do recommend people, if you're building anything, that's going to be managing a lot of money, reach out and get some security audits, maybe from people in the community on GitHub or other places, and beforehand, right? Because I think most things actually can be avoided by just asking. Yeah, so.
Well, one thing which I find weird is people often refer to smart contract developers as the users. They're like, oh, well, you need to have a good contract for your users. And I don't, I don't think like this. For me, the users are the people who actually use who actually use the network because they want to do something with it. Maybe because the application that they use for, I don't know, micro weather insurance happens to have a smart contract that runs on the Tezos blockchain. And so that's what they want to use. To me, that's a user. The developers aren't the users. They're an important community, and we definitely want to make their life easier, but they're not the end users.
As a developer, why would I choose Tezos? Is proof of stake more scalable and faster, or is there something with the language that allows me to do more? So what's really like from the community, what have you heard the benefits of what Tezos does?
The benefits isn't as much in the initial features as it is in the ability to improve itself. What we're building with Tezos, is a system with economic incentives for improving the protocol over time, and that's what essentially that's why you would want to be building on Tezos. It's this future-proof aspect. You're building here, and that this platform is not going to be made obsolete by another platform. Imagine people building on Bitcoin, and all of a sudden they say like, hey, you know what? All your work on Bitcoin straight out because now the new cool thing is Ethereum because Ethereum has smart contracts, and you're like, okay, I need to move. If you build on Tezos, no matter what, if someone comes up with a clever idea on how to run a ledger, like maybe they have a clever idea for consensus, maybe they have a clever idea for how to design for smart contract language, it's something that we can adopt. And so this is essentially what you're getting is this sustainability of the platform. But in terms of the immediate advantages, I would say that the proof of stake is going to give us quite a bit of scalability. The main difference with proof of work is that in proof of work, your blocks come out of a Poisson process. They come randomly in time. And so it's very important in proof of work that the time it takes to propagate a block be very small compared to the time between the blocks. It has to be almost negligible. Otherwise, you give a big advantage to centralized players. It's also very expensive. In a proof of stake system, what matters is that your blocks make it your block transmit time needs to be lower than the time between blocks, but it doesn't need to be much lower. It just needs to be lower. And so you can get a very large, a couple of order of magnitude gains in terms of throughput once you build it this way. So that would be one advantage. But I know that Ethereum has plans itself to have proof of stake. So maybe once they do, that won't be a huge differentiator. I think it's also the type of features that we're working on. Ethereum seems to be spending a lot of time and effort developing sharding. And the idea behind sharding for scalability is that you shouldn't have to validate all of the transaction in every block if you want to validate the chain. We don't think that's a good idea, and they're spending considerable effort on that. We don't think it's a good idea. Why? Because first of all, the demand for transaction is going to rise over time, especially with microtransaction, but it's still not going to rise as fast as CPU cost is falling. And so over time, it's not going to take you a very, very big machine to be able to validate the chain. Also, you can have live clients. You can look at other, that's the whole point of having a blockchain is you don't need to validate everything yourself. You can actually get a little bit from the miners and say, hey, what does the chain look like? What does this, head of the chain look like at this moment? And if you do this, you don't need to validate all those things. If you're so paranoid that you really need to validate the entire chain, then maybe you can, maybe spend a couple $1,000s on getting hardware to do this. It's not worth spending months and months of work doing sharding just to get that. It doesn't buy you anything. And also, the snarks that can condense all the transaction in a block into a single transactions, they're maybe a year and a half away. So a year and a half away, everyone's going to be able to validate the chain very, very quickly, regardless of the number of transactions. And so sharding will be useless at this point. Well, one thing we're doing differently, we're not going to develop sharding. Instead, we're going to try to have a really good light client. It's crazy that, when Ethereum was started, the reason they said they were doing a new chain instead of using Bitcoin, they said, well, we could do a Color coin with Bitcoin. But if we do a Color coin, we can't have an SPV client, and SPV client is super important. Then they built Ethereum. They got God knows how many million, and they still haven't built an SPV client. That seems just weird to me. So I think it's just over time, our priorities are going to be more sane.
Right. And how will people interact with Tezos? I think one big issue is people want to build applications that the end user can interact with, right, through the browser or through some type of GUI. So besides just the command line or using the wallet, what ways will people be able to interact with Tezos to make it functional for the traditional users?
So I think most people will not interact with it directly. If we do our job right, I don't think anyone will say like, hey, I'm using Tezos. I think that maybe they go to a website to book a plane tickets and they are offered plane delay insurance, and behind the scene it just happens on the Tezos network, and then and they don't need to necessarily know about it. They just know that the insurance didn't cost them that much because the underwriting cost was low, and that it has good reputation, and that the claims generally are processed fast, and that's all they know. And the reason it happened is because it's using smart contracts on the back end. But for me, it's a back, smart contracts and blockchains are back end technology, and this phase where users have wallets and all this thing, I think it's a temporary phase that we'll see maybe like still lasting for 3 or 4 years. But as time goes by, these are going to be pushed a lot more into an invisible layer of transactions that the end user won't really interact with.
So Tezos is doing an ICO. Why don't you talk about what the money will be used for and maybe the date and some of the information? You said early on you bootstrapped and self-funded, which I can understand, but now you're trying to scale. So
yeah,
where will you guys allocate those funds, and how will that help the project?
So just a small correction. We bootstrapped and self-funded for a couple of years. And then in the very recent past, we sold a small amount of pre-orders because we wanted to get to market faster, as people were realizing that governance was a thing and it mattered. And we were like, okay, we need to be able to release and before other projects start incorporating all our IDs. We don't have a hard date yet for the crowd sale. We're setting up a foundation in Switzerland, which is what many of the products are doing today. And essentially, we're targeting somewhere in May, either early May or late May. There's pros and cons for each. What we're hoping to do is collect enough funds to do a few security audits on the network before we release it. We have a testnet that's working, but we want to keep hammering at it. There's a lot of things that we can fix after the fact because we can upgrade the network, but there's some bugs that you can't really fix. Like if you somehow have a breakdown of consensus, that's really bad. And so we want to make sure that all of the killer bugs are completely ruled out and that we've done a very, very thorough audits before we actually launch it. And then after that, having a foundation will be helpful in kind of the network taking its baby step. By its design, it's supposed to have decentralized governance, and so it shouldn't need a foundation, but it will be helpful in the first years. We're hoping to fund development of privacy, like you mentioned, so having private transactions for helping fungibility. We're hoping to increase the scalability a bit. When we're going to launch, we're not going to try to use the full scalability that's available to us through proof of stake, because consensus algorithm is fairly new, so we're starting it with very conservative parameters that we want to loosen over time. And money permitting, we would like to set up some conferences, set up some marketing to talk about the project, increase the size of the dev team. Right now we have 7 full-time devs, and so we want to get probably around 20. One of the benefits of working with OCaml is that we have very productive programmers, and so we're able to do a lot more with smaller teams, and smaller teams have lesser communication costs inside the team. So that's something that's going to help us, but nonetheless, we need to grow the team. So that's what we hope to do with it.
So obviously, the Tezos token is what people receive. Do you consider it the kind of the currency of Tezos, or what powers the network? I know Ethereum originally is Ether gas. I don't know if people know, and now it's kind of seen as a currency because it's grown in its market cap and its dollar valuation. But to you, what is the Tezos token?
I mean, I think it's similar to the Ethereum token in this respect, which is this token that you can use to power smart contracts and make transactions.
So do you have any plan? You said interoperable chains and stuff don't bring much, but do you have any ideas of how you could bootstrap value onto Tezos? So if people did want a currency, do you think people might create sort of like a stable coin or alternative app tokens so that they can do exchange beyond just the Tezos?
I mean, this type of things seem to happen fairly spontaneously. So they might just use the Tezos token itself. We're not, we do support app coins, but we're not trying to be an app coin platform primarily. The primary mechanism by which Tezos get a new feature is by changing the core protocol, not launching app coins. I don't think that most applications need a coin, to be honest. Oftentimes, it just detracts from the application itself. And it makes a lot more sense to have this application use a native token as a platform than use yet another token.
So you don't see Tezos as, with Ethereum, as you said, we've seen a lot of ICOs and app tokens, and you don't see Tezos so much as an ICO platform as if people want a certain functionality, they update Tezos. So exactly. you don't think there will be as much buzz around, raising on top of that. The core focus will be improving Tezos for the usability of all the users, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean that's a different way to think about it. I think it's interesting. Governance is a really important question. Ethereum was obviously early and they couldn't tackle everything, but Bitcoin and a lot of spaces we're seeing this as an issue, and I know there are some coins already that are trying to do some governance or self-funding. So I do think the model is very interesting, and it's sort of a self-replicating sort of funding machine. It keeps improving itself. So
Yeah.
at the end of it all, you should end up with something much, much better over time. So I think that's great. Obviously, it's an OCaml, so if anyone is a developer and they're in OCaml, I guess they can reach out maybe after the sale or something when you're scaling.
Yep. Exactly.
Fork the GitHub or something, and you guys have Slack and all the other things on your site. So yeah, is that the best way to get
All the good
in
things,
touch?
yes.
Okay.
Yes, so you go to slack.tezos.com for an invite, and then the Slack itself is tezos.slack.com.
Great. And I had one last question.
Yes.
I believe it's your wife is the CEO.
That's correct, yes.
So how is that being, husband wife running cryptocurrency? Has that been an interesting experience so far?
Yeah, no, I think it's great because if one of us has an idea at 2 a.m., we can wake up the other person and just talk about it immediately, and we don't ever, there's no question of a work-life balance, because there's no like, oh, I've been working on this, but I need to get back to see my wife, because we're basically working on it every minute that we're together anyway. So it turns out it is very productive.
Well, great. I think you've answered all my questions, and yeah, check out Tezos.com. And we don't have a specific date for the sale, but get on Slack and you'll hear as soon as possible. Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a good one.
You too.